Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of Reading the Gospels Through Hebrew Eyes. When you hear about Jesus calming the storm on the sea at the end of Mark chapter 4, how do you view this? What's kind of going on here? Because I think most of the time when people hear this story, they think of it as sort of maybe a flex on the part of Jesus. He's showing his power by doing what he does. Well, I don't discount that. There's a whole lot more going on here. That's what I would call an underreading of this particular gospel narrative. So what would be a full reading? Well, to get a full reading of what's happening in Mark chapter 4, you got to go back to the background. You can't simply step into the New Testament without thinking about the Old Testament, because the evangelists assume a certain amount of knowledge on our part. They're not going to put footnotes in their gospel with cross references to Job 38 or to Psalm 107. They simply expect us as their intended audience to have a certain knowledge of the biblical narratives and the prophets and the Psalms so that we can carry that knowledge into their writings and on the basis of this read more fully exactly what's going on with Jesus when he's performing miracles, whatever those miracles might be, or whether he's in a certain location, the geographical pregnancy, if you will, of that location as we see it from the Old Testament. All of this is what the evangelists assume that we are knowing as we're reading their writings. So, when we study Mark chapter 4, we're going to ask ourselves, okay, what might the evangelist have in mind that he expects us to think about when we're reading his recounting of these events? All right, so that's a main task that we're going to have here, is look at the Old Testament background of the crossing of the sea and Jesus' calming of the storm. Let's begin with the opening couple of verses from Mark chapter 4 and a look at what archaeologists have found to be a first century fishing boat, very similar probably to the one that Jesus and his disciples were in. This is from Mark 4:35 to 36. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let's go across to the other side," that is, from Capernaum. And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. That is, he'd already been sitting in the boat because he'd been teaching in all the verses leading up to this, as we see in Mark 4, verse 1. And there were other boats with him. Now, that was a picture of the first century fishing boat that archaeologists have found. This is another picture of that particular boat, another angle. And as you can see, it's fairly well preserved. This was found in 1986 on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. It's about 27 feet long, 7.5 feet wide. It's not that big of a boat, but it was probably similar to the one that Jesus and his disciples would have used, just a common fishing vessel there on the Sea of Galilee. Speaking of the Sea of Galilee, this is an aerial view of that sea, just to kind of put things in perspective, because I think sometimes it's hard for us to kind of think of how small or how large this is. So it's only 13 miles long and 8 miles wide, a relatively small body of water. It would, for instance, take 26 of those, 26 Seas of Galilee, to take up the same landmass as the Great Salt Lake in Utah, if that kind of gives you an idea as to how small it was. Now, it's also significantly 700 feet below sea level, and it's surrounded by hills. And so when there's sudden changes in wind and temperature, this creates the violent storms that we often see happening in the Gospels. Now, one more thing to kind of keep in mind as we go through this is that what's about to happen is a display on the part of Jesus showing his exousia, which is the Greek word for power or authority. Now, we've seen this happen in a number of different ways already in the Gospel of Mark, if you're reading those first 4 chapters leading up to this. So we've seen Jesus displaying his exousia while he performs miracles of healing and he casts out demons. But we're going to see it next, the first time, where he performs what's called a nature miracle. He's going to calm the sea. And then if you transition into chapter 5 of Mark, he's going to cast out all those demons from that man, the demons that call themselves Legion. That's 5:1 through 24. Following that, Jesus is going to display his exousia once more by healing a woman who had been hemorrhaging for 12 years. That's 25 to 34. And then finally, he's going to display his exousia by raising the daughter of Jairus back to life again. That's 21 through 24 and 35 through 43. All of these are different ways that Jesus is revealing that he speaks and acts as one who has divine exousia, divine authority, divine power, and he's exercising that on behalf of other people. That's an important point to keep in mind. Every miracle that Jesus performs is not for himself, but for others. So his miracles themselves are a display of divine power, but they're a display of this divine power that is displayed in mercy and compassion and love and protection for other people. So God in Christ is showing his power, but he's not doing it for himself, but he's doing it for his disciples, or for the women who are suffering, or for the demon possessed, or for the daughter of Jairus by raising her back to life. So the miracles themselves, yes, they display divine power, but more than that, they display divine compassion. Okay, let's pick up the account in Mark where we left off. This is verses 37 through 39. A great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he, that is Jesus, was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, Teacher, don't you care that we are perishing? And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. Now, the reason I've called this from mega storm to mega calm is because if you look at that phrase, great windstorm and great calm in the Greek adjective that's used in both those cases to describe the windstorm and the calm is megale, which is a form of megas, from which we get our English word mega. So the great storm begins, and then the great calm ends this particular section. Now, as I've already said, one of the things that the evangelists want us to ask ourselves is, what in the Old Testament might we connect this with? Where are there storm stories? Where are there actions of Yahweh that are in some way similar to what's happening with Jesus and his disciples? Now, one of the first ones that probably comes to mind, because there's a number of parallels here, is that of Jonah. Now, if you go to Jonah chapter 1, verses 4 through 6, notice all the parallels, thematic and language parallels, that you have happening between Mark 4 and Jonah 1. God hurls a great wind upon the sea, or a mighty tempest on the sea, just like now a storm has fallen upon the Sea of Galilee. The ship threatened to break up in the case of Jonah, and of course you have a danger to the ship in Mark 4. The mariners were afraid in Jonah 1. The disciples are afraid in Mark 4. Jonah was fast asleep. Jesus was also fast asleep. And so the captain wakes him up and say, What do you mean, you sleeper? And he tells him to get up and call on his God. The disciples go to Jesus and say, Teacher, don't you get that we're perishing? And then Jesus gets up, and he doesn't pray, but instead he is going to speak divine authoritative words. So Jonah obviously comes to mind as one background here, but I think that when Mark wrote this particular story, if there's one section in the Old Testament that was kind of circling through his mind as he penned these words, it wasn't from the Torah, it wasn't from Job, it wasn't from Jonah. Instead, it was from one of the hymns of Israel, Psalm 107. Now, if you're familiar with Psalm 107, it's very carefully constructed. You have 4 different episodes dealing with people in different kinds of jeopardy who call upon the Lord, and the Lord answers them. Now, one of these describes sailors who are in jeopardy. Now, listen to the language of Psalm 107 and see how it provides kind of the verbal background for what's happening in Mark 4. This is verses 23 through 32. I won't read the whole thing, just highlight certain sections. Some went down to the sea in ships, so we're dealing here with sailors. What happens? God commands and raises up a stormy wind. The sailors, their courage melts away in the midst of this. So what do? They cry out to the Lord in their trouble. And what does he do? He delivers them from their distress. He made the storm be still so that the waves of the sea were hushed, and then he brought them to their desired haven. If you look at the entire context of those verses in Psalm 107, it's almost a prophecy, if you will, of what's happening in Mark chapter 4. You have these guys who are sailors, they're caught in a storm, they're in trouble, they're in jeopardy, so they cry out to God, and God answers them. Now, of course, in Psalm 107, it's Yahweh who answers them. He's the one who delivers them. And of course, as we'll see, it's Yahweh himself, Yahweh incarnate in Christ Jesus, who rescues the disciples. Now, those Jonah and Psalm 107 are two examples, but there's more. And what helps us to understand these more examples is the particular language that's used to describe Jesus' rebuke of the wind. So if you look in Mark 4:39, the Greek verb that's used there is epitimao. Jesus spoke and rebuked. He epitimaoed the wind. Now, if you go back to the Old Testament Greek translation, the Septuagint, you'll see that most of the time when epitimao is used in the Septuagint, it's translating the Hebrew verb ga'ar. So in the Old Testament, whether you're reading it in its original Hebrew or in its Greek translation, epitimao or ga'ar, those are the technical words for divine rebuke over the world's forces of evil and chaos and ruin. There's a number of examples that we could look at. I just want to focus on two. Psalm 106:9 says that Yahweh rebukes the Red Sea. This is a poetic reflection upon what happened in Exodus. So Yahweh rebukes, he ga'ars or he epitimaos the Red Sea. And in Nahum 1:4, Yahweh rebukes seas or rivers in general. So we might ask ourselves, well, where else do we have the language of divine rebuke associated with waters of some sort? Well, there's several different places. For instance, this is the background. We've already seen this in Psalm 106, but this is the background of what's happening in those two famous chapters, Exodus 14 and 15, when Israel crosses the Red Sea. So the particular language that's used there is not of rebuke, but rebuke is how this narrative and how the poem of Moses, which follows it, how that was interpreted. Because, notice what God is doing. This is from Exodus 14. God drives the sea back by a strong east wind all night. He made the sea dry land. So this is God actively using his divine authority to make the sea do his bidding. And of course, Israel passes through on dry ground. Now, in the Song of Moses, which follows that, Exodus 15, we have the description of God's right hand, his mighty power. And what is he doing? He's overthrowing the adversary. And notice the language here. This is verse 7 or 8 of Exodus 15. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The floods stood up in a heap. The deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. So this is God using his divine exousia, his divine authority or power, to do what? To make creation do his bidding so that his people might go through safely onto dry ground. And at the same time, then, he's going to use these same waters to crush the heads of Israel's enemies. So Exodus 14 to 15 are the background here as well. But there's more. If you look at Job and the Psalms, we see some more examples of this. So Psalm 65:7, Yahweh stills the roaring of the seas, the roaring of the waves, the tumult of the peoples. Psalm 89 describes God as ruling the raging of the sea. And when its waters rise, he crushes them. In fact, he crushes Rahab, which is a mythological sea monster, like a carcass, and scatters the enemies with his mighty arm. And then Job 38, which in some traditions is going to be the Old Testament reading for this coming Sunday, we have God shutting the sea in with doors. He's making the clouds its garment, and he's saying how far the sea can go and no further. So this is God's rebuke of Job, in which he's displaying his divine power by having full control over the sea. And at the very bottom of the slide, it's fascinating. If you look at examples of the noun for rebuke, which is formed from ga'ar, the noun is ga'ara. Look at 2 Samuel 22:16, Psalm 76:6, and Psalm 104:7, because all those are examples of where, once more, God is rebuking the waters. Now, all of this is going to be then the background of what happens in Mark chapter 4. So Jesus, as Yahweh, rebukes the Sea of Galilee, rebukes the winds, rebukes the storm. And this, then, is the culmination of all these various things happening from the Old Testament, from the crossing of the Red Sea, and we might add the crossing of the Jordan, to Jonah asleep on the boat during the storm, to Yahweh's rule of the sea in Job and Psalms, to the sailors in the storm in Psalm 107. All of this is the background for what Jesus does. When he stands up, he's awake, and he opens his mouth in order to speak with divine exousia and bring calm where before there had been a storm, to bring peace where before there was chaos. Now, let's wrap it up with the closing verses. This is from Mark 4:40 and 41. Jesus said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Well, who is this? This is, first of all, the prophet who's greater than Jonah, because he doesn't need to call upon God, because he himself speaks authoritative words, because he himself is God. Who is this? He's the incarnate Word, by whom the winds and the waters were created, and who still obey his creative voice. And he's Yahweh himself, who rebuked the Red Sea for the 12 tribes of Israel to pass over, and now rebukes the Sea of Galilee for his 12 disciples to pass over to the other side. So Mark chapter 4 is a narrative display of how Jesus, as Yahweh incarnate, uses his exousia, his power, his authority, to bring calm in the midst of chaos, to bring serenity in the midst of a storm, in order that he might do this for his disciples, and in doing this for his disciples, reveal who he is and also who he is for them. They are the new Israel. And Yahweh, as with them, is now going to bring them safely to the other side, just like he brought Israel safely to the other side in the crossing of the Red Sea. So in just a few verses, you have sections from Exodus 14 and 15, echoes of creation in Genesis 1, Job 38, Psalm 107, and all those other psalms and prophets which describe God's rebuke of the elements of nature in order to do good for his people. All of that is then compressed into these few lines from Mark chapter 4 to reveal that Jesus is both our Lord and our God. He is Yahweh in the flesh, the Yahweh who has done great things for his people and who continues to do great things for his church. As always, I hope that this particular interpretation and this journey from the Old Testament to the New Testament was helpful to you. If it is, please share this with your friends. I pray that you all are doing well, and I pray the Lord's peace and mercy be yours in abundance. We'll see you next week.